Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all, officials of ministry and institutions and members of the media, NGOs, individuals, of course, people online and the panelists. I'm Bertje Koors from Earthlife Namibia, an NGO addressing controversial issues with emphasis on environmental and social problems. Today we are launching the scientific report, Least Cost Energy Investment Study for Namibia, an analysis of the costs, risks, and impacts of pursuing an energy future reliant on hydropower versus solar and wind. I trust you all got a copy in front of you. I believe the study will give you a solid impression of least cost and sustainable energy opportunity in Namibia through solar and wind. We all know that Namibia is blessed with abundant solar and wind energy, which is one of the reasons that green hydrogen is supposed to be produced in Namibia in the near or far future. We don't know yet. But unfortunately, solar and wind are both totally underutilized in Namibia. Instead of using these rich and cost-free resources, expensive and dirty electricity is imported from neighboring countries. I quickly want to touch, or briefly want to touch, on the hydropower at the Konene. Earthlife Namibia, together with International Rivers, had already expressed concerns about the Epupa project far back in the 1990s. Our present interest in the proposed Baines project results from the time of Epupa, when the affected Ovahimba opposed the project and clearly said, "Don't take our land the Konene from us. This is our life." So we International Rivers and Earthlife Namibia visited the Himba to learn about their opinion on the construction of the Baines and the Baines Dam and the hydropower plant. The viewpoint of the affected Himba has not changed since Epupa. As traditional semi-nomadic cattle herders, they are dependent on the grazing land. So they say our ecological and social base would be destroyed by the dam. We don't need a saving bank. Our bank is our land and our animals. So that's what we live on. I want to make some general announcements. In order to reach an international audience, regional media and civil society, this event is live streamed and will be recorded. The recording will be made available via email to those who are here and on live stream. Photos will be taken of the event. I kindly ask you to indicate if you have objections to be photographed. After the presentation by the panelists, ample time is allocated for questions and answers. We hope for a lively discussion. After the event, some refreshments will be offered in the hall, so please don't rush back to work or home and use the opportunity for further exchange. And I kindly ask you to please put your cell phones on silent. I now want to introduce to you Mrs. Sesive Mota from International Rivers. Sesive is facilitating the meeting. Sesive is the Africa Program Director of International Rivers. She works to protect Africa's rivers, campaign against destructive dams and their negative impacts on communities, and promote sustainable energy solutions. She has worked on environmental, social justice, and human rights issues in Africa, has supported communities impacted by extractive industries and engaged policymakers in pursuit of energy justice. Holding a degree in social science, her goal is to campaign to champion environmental protection and human rights. So I give the floor to Cecilia.
Thank you, Bertrand. And good morning to everybody, to all the panelists and to everybody in the room and online. As a non-profit, non-governmental organization, International Rivers is motivated by the need to protect and conserve the environment, where healthy rivers and the rights of local communities are valued and are protected. As such, we've been concerned about the environmental impacts of the proposed Baines hydropower project, particularly on indigenous communities and also on the environment. And that has motivated us, together with EarthLife Namibia, to find independent research that could support Namibia in making critical energy decisions to meet its growing demand, and to do that at a least cost, considering social, considering environmental risks, as well as exposure to climate change. So being at a critical point in the development of its energy system, Namibia needs to increase its electricity supply in order to meet current and future demand in a way that both delivers social benefits and climate resilience. I want to introduce TMP Public, who are conducting or have conducted this independent research. As Bertrand indicated, the title of the research, and as you can see from the reports, is A Least Cost Energy Study of Namibia, analyzing the costs, risks, and impacts of pursuing an energy future reliant on hydropower versus solar and wind. One of the authors, Justin Mule, is with us here today. He will take up the bulk of the time here, and he will present the findings of the report. He has been an associate at TMP Public since 2020. He supports the company's work on renewable energy and climate change, primarily through research, analysis, and data collection processes. Thank you, Justin, for joining us.
So I'm going to chat through kind of three key parts of the presentation. Firstly, I'll briefly touch on, which Suziwe has touched on a little bit, why we produced this report, and that's really informed the kind of approach that we've taken and the different assessment approaches that we've taken. I'm then going to kind of talk more in detail about those specific approaches, kind of our methodologies behind the different assessment approaches. And then lastly, I'll chat through some of the key findings that came out of the report. So first off, why did we produce this report? And it's really it comes from this recognition that Namibia is at this really important point in its energy transition where it has this opportunity to meet these kind of extreme demands in future, but also in order to do this in a way that supports economic growth, is climate resilient, because we know that climate change is increasingly an important factor, and also improves kind of social livelihoods in a way that really matters. So how do we do this? This is kind of this key challenge to this report, is how do we support Namibia to do this in a way that's fast, in a way that's climate resilient, in a way that can help as many people as quickly as possible. So it's with that sort of framing that we've taken a slightly different approach to understanding this kind of macro view of Namibia's energy system. So we both did that from a cost perspective, but then also trying to understand some of the key social, environmental, and climate factors associated with that macro picture. So this is quite tricky to do without the slides, but going to go on ahead anyway. It's just because it might be quite abstract without any visual aid, but we'll do our best. So there's a couple of, the approach that we took was kind of a multi-layered approach. So we didn't have one single kind of overarching model to understand Namibia's kind of least cost energy future. We started with a least cost model to do that, but then we overlaid a number of other assessments to kind of further look at some of those key technologies that were identified in that least cost model from different kind of viewpoints. So from social perspective, climate perspective, cost perspective. So the least cost model that we used is an open source model called the Open Source Energy Modeling System, or Osmosis for short. And it's been used for over 10 years now in national planning processes. It's also been used by large international organizations like the UN, the World Bank, and by a range of academics as well. There are many papers out there that incorporate this modeling. So yeah, all of these assumptions and parameters are in the report in the appendix. So I really urge you to go and have a look at that. But most, if not all of those assumptions were taken from Namibia's latest draft integrated resource plan, as well as other kind of locally available assumptions on existing technologies in Namibia. So we're really obviously trying to be as locally representative as possible in that modeling process. And the result of this model is these kind of so as I said, the model is designed to identify the least cost options per year up until 2040, and that was the sort of time frame we used. We then carried out a range of other assessments, which was based on that Landscope tool that I mentioned. And what RiverScope is it's similar to Landscope. It's this geospatial tool to identify key social and environmental risks, which we can then connect to financial metrics like the net present value and levelized cost of electricity. And I'll explain how we do that in a second. So essentially, the methodology is based on an approach that we've developed through Landscope. And how it works is we compare. So in order to identify these different risk indicators, we compare two pools of hydropower project cases. So the one pools have got, say, 180 cases. The other ones have got about 90 cases. And the one pool is all projects that have experienced problems and delays because of social and environmental factors. And the other pool have no reported problems. And what we do is we make this comparison using a whole range of different indicators to see if there's any statistical correlation between those projects that have experienced delays and those that haven't. And we found that there were 17 different social and environmental indicators that showed a strong statistical correlation with projects that experienced delays. So for example, some of the indicators were in areas that had experienced quite extreme poverty or conflict events in the past, were more statistically correlated to the pool of cases that experienced delays. And what that allows us to do is we can then use those indicators to assess new areas to see how they compare to those two different pools of either problematic cases or less problematic cases. And that allows us to get a sense of kind of what the local social and environmental risk context is like in those different areas. Okay, great. I see we've got the presentation going. So I'm going to flick through these. This is our approach, osmosis model, least cost options. This is the RiverScope financial analysis that we use to focus on veins. And this is the methodology that we have used to develop the RiverScope tool. So how that works is once we have these 17 different indicators, and we can assess different projects on a scale of 0 to 100, and we then correlate that score to a delay model based on a number of cases that have experienced delays, and that gives us a sense of the potential delay that a project might experience because of the social and environmental, the underlying social and environmental risks that it has experienced. And with those delays, we can then input that into a financial modeling process, a discounted cash flow model, to understand how that delay might affect key financial metrics like the net present value and the levelized cost of electricity. The next layer of assessment is we did a suitability analysis for solar and wind across Namibia. And this kind of drew on a lot of the kind of common metrics that you would see in a solar and wind siting assessment. So things like avoiding protected areas, avoiding kind of densely populated areas, water bodies, kind of those common things. And then we overlaid that with a social risk model, which is based on the Landscope tool that I've mentioned. So similarly, Landscope relies on that same statistical process, comparing problematic cases to non-problematic cases to identify key social, environmental, and governance indicators. Now, in our experience, this kind of view of social risk, especially at a macro level, is often missing from kind of suitability assessments, which tend to be quite technically focused. And we think that that is I think that that's a bit of an oversight, because we know that social dynamics can often have a real impact on the smooth rollout of large infrastructure projects. Our third layer of assessment was a climate risk assessment. So we know that we already passed the 1 degree global warming in roughly 2017. And we expect that between roughly 2028 and 2032, we're going to hit the 1.5. There's a bit of a range there, but we can roughly say it's going to be around the 2030s. So that's already, our kind of time frame is the next 10 years, which is just around the corner in the sort of timescales that we're talking about with some of these projects. And we thought that that was particularly relevant in this case because when we consider a project like Baines, which has a very long construction time, for example, it means that some of these risks are going to start to come out really as these projects come online. So that's a really important factor to consider. And then finally, we kind of wrap up all of these more quantitative assessments with a qualitative research and analysis process. So we wrap that all up with, and this is kind of the qualitative layer, because we know that, numbers don't always paint the full picture. What do they say? Something about statistics, lies, and damn lies and statistics. So this kind of final part of the process is about trying to get a more qualitative, deeper understanding of these issues. So moving on to the kind of key part of this whole process, what were some of the key findings? So first and foremost, our least cost energy model results. So we found that the least cost investment plan to 2040 was primarily solar and wind with or without storage. So you can see there, up to 70% of the country's installed capacity was selected by 2030, and around 77% by 2040. Now, it's also worth pointing out, can you click next, that there was no new hydropower in that least cost results, unless we added the cost of grid connection to our assumptions. And that's kind of really important to point out, because oftentimes large hydropower projects, the grid connection costs are extremely high, generally because they need to be developed in remote locations. They're quite far from existing infrastructure. So that's an important thing to leave out. Where we did add the cost of grid connection, there was something like 59 megawatts of new hydropower, which was really quite marginal. although our results were not exactly the same as the recent IRP, which would be unusual, they were similar in the sense that the IRP similarly suggested that the least cost options were solar and wind with storage, and they also found that no hydropower was included in any of those least cost options, unless it was specifically input into those scenarios. So this graph gives you a sense of the generation mix from the results. And you can see there, I mean, the main takeaway there is the solar and wind, with or without storage, is really increasing rapidly up until 2040. Now, obviously, there are a number of assumptions in there around new projects coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. Again, all of that can be found in the report in the appendix. And there was also an important assumption that we assumed that import reliance would slowly decline up until 2028, up until 20%. That might be quite an ambitious assumption. But again, you know, these models can be adjusted and tweaked and rerun, you know, depending on what scenario you're trying to plan for. And we try to make this kind of as representative as kind of what Namibia's ambitions are from a policy perspective. And yeah, that's the results that we came to. So taking a closer look at this comparison between hydropower and solar and wind options, we used the RiverScope tool here to do that. And what RiverScope really does is provides this kind of risk-adjusted comparison on both the lead times, but then also the associated cost of electricity for those different projects. Now, the RiverScope analysis found that Baines was heavily exposed to social and environmental risks. And as a result, it could expose the project to delays of 2.5 to 3 years. Now, that's of course, that's on top of already long construction times of between 5 and 7 years. And that's a really important thing to consider when you're comparing it to alternative technologies like solar and wind, which can be developed in less than half the time. And, you know, the reason for that really is at a very basic level, solar and wind projects are just a lot easier and technically easier to put on the ground. And they're also, as a result, their impacts are generally a lot easier to manage. So they're a lot less exposed to the kinds of local opposition that we've seen, for example, at a project like Baines. So this graph on the left here shows you how these delays, how these potential delays will affect the cost of electricity for Baines, which is represented by the dotted blue line at the top. And we compared that to the projected falling costs of solar and wind, which is represented by the two green lines. Now, it's worth pointing out that the cost curves for solar and wind are based on existing local projects. So these are very much locally representative. Of course, the kind of falling cost curves, they're taken from IRENA. So there are some assumptions there, but we know that the costs of these technologies are very likely to decline. And it really, I mean, the comparison there is regardless of that kind of assumption is stark. So what I wanted to point out, if you can click next, please. What I want to point out is that difference between, if we assume that Baines were to come online in 2028, which would essentially mean starting construction immediately without any kinds of delays, it would already be 133% more expensive than local solar options. But if it was delayed by, say, 2.5 years, up until 2031, that cost difference would increase to 166%. Now, that's a really important and stark difference when we're considering what technologies to look for and what technologies to focus on in the next 5 to 10 years. And what this all really reflects at the end of the day is that the longer that it takes for these very large projects to come online, the less competitive they're becoming to existing options that, you know, are both already being developed today and can be developed within two sort of years time frame. Our second layer of assessment was the climate risk assessment, and this focused quite specifically on the Kunene River Basin, as I mentioned. And there's a couple of things to point out about this graph. And the first thing is that the risk scale there starts at 0.5, but actually, well, it does on the map, but actually it's from 0 to 1. So anything from 0.5 up is considered a high risk. And what this really indicates is that extreme drought events in the Kunene River Basin are very likely to become a lot more frequent between now and roughly between 2028 and 2032. And again, that's a really important consideration for projects that are going to be coming online starting from, say, 2030 or 2028, that sort of time frame. The other thing to point out that comes out in this graphic is the various other competing interests for water in the same basin, right? So I'm almost certain that we have not mapped nearly all of the water projects in here, but we've found those that we could. And again, it's trying to emphasize this fact that at the same time that climate extremes are getting more intense, we're also seeing more development of water infrastructure projects in the same basin. And that's just going to increase the competition for available water resources. And that's just a huge risk factor for projects that are relying on essentially a single water basin for financial viability, but also for energy security. And the last thing to point out here before we move on to the last slide is that Namibia is already exposed to these risks, right? So we know that Namibia is already heavily reliant on hydropower, so it's already exposed to these climate risks. And that just raises concern about kind of further adding to that risk exposure. And it just raises some key questions about that that need to be considered. Of course, by contrast, solar and wind are not immune to climate shocks, but they are able to be developed in a way that is a lot more resilient. And that's by virtue of the fact that they can be developed on smaller scales, they can be spread geographically. So if you have a severe climate impact in one area, that doesn't necessarily mean you're wiping out the entire energy system. Our final layer of assessment was the suitability analysis. And this really confirmed what we kind of knew already, that Namibia has really excellent world-class solar and wind resources. So these two maps, the left one shows you the suitability maps for solar, and the right one shows you that for wind. And it's worth pointing out that, so darker green reflects better solar resources or solar or wind resources, and lighter is still suitable, but not as good. It's worth pointing out that anything in color there is considered suitable. So this is a case of being already good to just absolutely excellent. So any of those areas would be worth exploring as for further potential. And as I mentioned already, this excludes kind of key areas like protected areas, extreme slopes, densely populated areas, those kinds of common constraints. And we found that 40% of these total suitable areas were within 50 kilometers of existing transmission and road infrastructure. So there's that accessibility. And obviously areas outside of that would be suitable for off-grid options as well. Now, of course, it's worth emphasizing that you would still need to, do thorough technical assessments, thorough EIAs, etc., in these different areas. This is very much just a kind of a macro view of what's available. But even that alone, you can see it's extremely widespread across the country. But as I mentioned previously, in our view, a lot of these renewable energy siting assessments tend to neglect this kind of social risk element of these processes early on, and that's a problem when we think about what that can mean for project lead times and also the financial viability of those projects if they're not taking these considerations early in the assessment process. So what we've done here is we have overlaid the best solar and wind resources. So those were the dark green areas on the previous two maps. And we've overlaid that with our Landscope tool, which identifies local social risk contexts for infrastructure projects. And again, we've capped it at from 0 to 100, we've capped it at 60. So you can consider all of these areas in here relatively low social risk. And again, it's just to show that you would need to go into these areas and you would need to do thorough assessments. You would need to do thorough community engagement, all of these key kind of fundamental processes. But the area to do that is just huge across Namibia. And that's a really important thing to emphasize. We did a kind of quick calculation based on these most suitable areas. And we found that it would take less than 0.1% of these areas to develop the 1.7 gigawatts of solar and wind that our least cost model identified to 2040. And that's just an absolute fraction of what's available. So I think with that, I'll leave it there and we'll move on to Conrad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Justin. I mean, thanks for taking us through your approach to the methodology that you used, some of the key findings, which are interestingly, so I'm out of breath, but are interestingly quite similar to the IRP, the draft NIRP, and they should hopefully move decision makers in the direction of solar and wind and away from, the more risky and costly options. And, I expect that there will be questions for you based on your findings. We have space for that towards the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Conrad Roden, who's an electrical engineer from Germany. He holds an MBA degree. He's lived in Namibia since 1989, and he's the founder of Solar Age Namibia for Applied Photovoltaics. And he has been there from 1989 until 2017. He's a campaigner for a just energy transition and now a part-time consultant in renewable energy and e-mobility. So Conrad will just give us a brief history of energy in Namibia, and as a technician on renewable energy, he'll be able to unpack sort of the state of alternative energy within the country and what he would like to see in the renewable energy space within the country. Thanks, Conrad. Over to you.
Greetings to everybody. Baines hydro versus solar PV, or how a dead horse is still ridden. This is how I call my presentation, because I think that Baines will not come. On the other hand, we can see the special value in the analysis we just heard about, because it can lay the path how Namibia should go into the future. I'm doing this presentation as a member of REON, the Renewable Energy Industry Association of Namibia. I had the privilege to chair this association in a critical time when we could support and push the net metering rules for Namibia to be legalized. I dedicate this short presentation to all those who sensitized Namibia in terms of EPUPA and Baines, like Bertin Kors, Earthlife, but also all those who gave input and to the alternatives, and that was those days International Rivers Network and many other supporters in this issue, and obviously all those like Dr. Hermann Scher who kicked off basically the global revolution in terms of solar and wind and by creating the right laws that kickstarted the big industries. Without those, we wouldn't sit here today and talk about alternatives. Here you see a close-up picture of the dam area. It's a model how the dam would fill from the dam wall about 40 kilometers eastwards to where the Pooper Falls are on the right side. And in terms of my what I'm going to say later, you see the water area, and you see the required area to generate the same amount of electricity with photovoltaics. That means it's just a comparison. Obviously, solar has the big advantage that it can put everywhere inside the country where it's needed. One would never put it in one solid square into the middle of nowhere. I quickly want, from the internal Namibian perspective, point out the disadvantages of the Baines hydro project. As we heard, it will be far more costly than a PV solar and also wind power. We will need a high voltage power line and roads from the dams through very rough terrain. We will have a water surface of 5,900 hectares, which evaporates some 590,000 tons of water per hot day, which is in the region of 20% of the low season runoff of the river. So if we look at the Konene, we also must understand this is a sensitive habitat. You cannot block off the river completely, because otherwise the life in the river downstream will die. So this also is relevant today. They cannot shut down the river completely in order to store water for the peak times. Yeah, out of what I know, it will take a minimum of 10 years to come online. We will have a lengthy power contract to be signed with Angola. We will need to share the power 50-50 with Angola. So I wouldn't know, Justin, on what power plant size did you base how many megawatt hydro?
Actually halved it. Yeah.
You halved it. Okay.
We halved it because we knew that exactly. Just because otherwise the costing would change for, you know, if it was specifically for Namibia. Because we knew that Namibia is only going to get half, right? So you can't. It might otherwise it almost certainly wouldn't have been involved in the model at all.
Okay. And what is important that increasingly for most of the year, because of the lack of water, Baines would only be a peaking station. And to run the turbines 24/7, it's not possible. Only 1.7 terawatt hours, that was an Empower figure, but I had to ask them for that figure. Only 1.7 terawatt hours of the 4.5 terawatt hour Namibia requires could come from that huge development and costly development. And 5 terawatt hours would be possible if there would be enough water in the Konene. And that problem is worsened by the upstream water abstraction for agricultural projects in Angola, where some huge developments are taking place with growing rice and other activities that take a lot of water abstraction. And the last 2 points are also very important. It will not be Namibia's own power source because of the sharing with Angola. And as Justin also put it in other words, it will mean an investment that puts all eggs in one basket, relying on the Kunene River, which is not reliable anymore in bringing the water to the Ruacana and also to a possible Bain station. And now the positive side. Solar PV will be cost effective. We just heard from the study. Solar panels cost less than 10% of what they were in 1995 when we first talked in the EPUPA debate, and when everybody said, no, solar is too expensive, forget about it. And it will only take up 1,800 hectares. You remember this little red square in the picture of the dam site for the same output that Bains could yield. Obviously, solar plants can be sized and placed according to power requirements. That means you build them as you need them, and that has also huge implications, as we heard from the study, with regard to financing costs. Storage for solar falls in price with new technologies and would cost together with solar less than Bains. It's not only the lithium battery with some constraints in the raw materials, but also the sodium sulfur battery, the Zebra battery, and other battery technologies, and also other storage technologies like gravity storage, etc. Solar could be built where the need for power is and not in the most remote corner of the country with all the losses involved, because the power from a power station has to be evacuated over 100 kilometers into the load centers where the energy is needed in Namibia. Solar would and could start right now and would be built as appropriate installments. So you don't have to do it in one go. While a huge hydro station has to be secured in full in finance from day one. Solar would be really Namibia's own indigenous energy solution compared to a shared solution. Solar investments will attract all the money in the world. Hydro investments for the Kaoko region with all the implications you also talked about will not. Solar would mean appropriate power for the rural parts of the Kunene region for energy and water pumping. So we have the problem with the Bains project that we're putting a white elephant into the remotest part of the country, while the people on the ground, except maybe from some wheelbarrow pushing and other jobs during construction, don't have any. They don't have anything from the project. While distributed small solar could really make that area more sustainable. If you think of solar water pumping, and having modern energy facilities for schools and for general purposes. So solar would give the people in that area also more time to adapt compared to a huge development, which for a short time will bring hundreds or thousands even of workers into the area. And then the white elephant would stand there. Yeah, I just get you one slide. What kills a horse? I want to get your attention to the yellow lines that show how only since 2009 and 2022, the price for solar came down. And also, if you go to the purple curve, how the battery storage came down in price. And this is only since 2009. As I said before, from 1995, when we talked the PUPA debate first, the prices came down by 90% to 10%, even less than 10% today. Yeah, from my own not only experience, but a system which is based in Windhoek. Look at the blue columns. They show for every month in the year in 2022. So this is very actual. It was the yield of a roof-mounted solar plant last year. You can see the blue. In blue, we have what was produced. In gray, what the model projected. So we have months where the system produced a little bit less. We have months where the system produced more. We can see very nicely that the winter, which is a huge problem in Europe for solar systems, because in Europe, the blue would only be 10% or even less in winter per month. But here we have a very nice flat output of a photovoltaic plant in central Namibia. If we look, the February month of last year was the lowest, and that was because of the rainy season, and we had some clouds. And the next chart, please. It shows how that month, that worst case month, looked like. And if you have the red line shows you what is the average through the year output of the plant, 85 kilowatt hours per day. And now you can see that even in the worst case months, the daily output or the daily yield was hardly less than 50%, with many days over the yearly average per day. And so the case I want to make, and the next slide, please, that PV solar will be distributed throughout the country, not only on one roof in Windhoek, and thus avoiding complete cloud cover shutdown. It will be complemented with wind energy, partly dovetailing with solar PV. So when PV is not producing, wind will. And with a minimum of local storage, strong power fluctuations can be avoided. And if we can have the next slide, which is a picture, an aerial picture from the large 10 megawatt plant near Gobabis. There you can see cloud cover, and it was moving fast that day. I also have that slide in video, how a cloud cover can shut down, or even not shut down, but choke the output of a solar plant from maybe 100 to 20% within 1 or 2 minutes if the clouds travel pretty fast. But that means we need storage only to equal out and to balance these fluctuations. And next slide, please. With this, I come to the conclusion, if one PV solar system in one location barely needs more than 36 hours of storage, Namibia can be considered a country where long duration electricity storage is not required. Even large new solar and wind plants should have a compulsory complement of 1 or 2 hours, full load hours of battery storage. And my conclusion further, yes, large hydro energy also falls under renewable energy. But the Baines case shows renewable energy does not automatically mean sustainable energy production. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Conrad. From the perspective of a renewable energy campaigner, I mean, you've really provided a useful comparison between Baines and solar, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of both. And I mean, at the end, you were sort of dismantling the idea that big destructive hydro can and should be considered renewable, and it's definitely not the case. That it is not a renewable source of energy. So thank you for your input. Our next speaker is Karipetra Warije. Karipetra has started serving the community of Kunene, particularly Epupa and Omatendeka. During his early years of working as a community liaison officer for Project Kayoko Land, he was appointed as the CEO of Kayoko Epupa Development Foundation, and he was then later employed by the Integrated Rural Development and Nature Conservation Organization, IRDNC, as a facilitator. During his tenure, he founded Epupa Conservancy and was appointed as the manager by the community. He acted as a community liaison officer in Namibia and Angola for the feasibility study conducted on the Baines hydroelectric power plant. He's also done various trainings, and he is the chairperson of the Biocultural Protocol Committee, which is founded in 2022, working towards the protection of the rights of the Himba and the preservation of their culture. So Karipetra is going to speak and give us a community perspective, looking at what are the energy needs of indigenous communities, and how best can those needs be met. Over to you, Karipetra. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I want to tackle the current energy situation for indigenous community in our respective remote area where we are based. The majority of us, we are full-time farmers, and we having cell phones and the radio, what we use for communication. But those radio and cell phone need to be charged each and every day. And solar charge can be one of the efficient solar charging energies for our communities. And some donors funding in Namibia, they supported our rural farmer to replace diesel water pump, which was having a lot of maintenance on it, diesel fuel, and also to replace the engine oil in the diesel pump machine. those were replaced with a solar water pump in order to supply water for the farmer, livestock, and for themselves. This is a current situation. The need in relation to energy in Kunene North, we need affordable energy due to the fact that majority of us are farmer. We are farming beyond the red line, and our marketing strategy is very minimal. We need energy which cannot affect our lifestyle, our livelihood, our livelihood, and also our environment. Lastly, is the solution to the energy to our community. We need, because Namibia is well known as a dry and hot country, solar energy is needed for us as a farmer. The other thing, we need more solar water pump. As I said before, and remote clinics and schools need solar energy for lighting, and also conservancy officers. Therefore, the solar energy and wind energy, also a second option. It's the only energy which we can afford, because our monthly cash flow is very minimal comparing to those who are full-time employee in government or private sectors. With few remarks, I can advise or plead to my government to take solar energy in consideration as one of reasonable energy to our minority community group in Kunene North. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karipetra, for your input. And I think leading from that, we as International Rivers and Earthlife Namibia have got recommendations which are based on the findings of the report. These are actually documented in the policy brief, which is available in hard copy and is also available online, and the link will be shared immediately after this. So in particular, for decision makers, we have some recommendations, and those recommendations are that firstly, decision makers should pursue a least cost energy pathway that is based primarily on solar, wind, and energy storage. That decision makers should reconsider any further interest in the Baines project, because it would otherwise derail the country's path to a low cost and secure energy future. We also recommend that they follow the analysis found in this report as produced by TMP and is also in the IRP, which supports investment in wind and solar rather than hydropower and fossil fuels, thereby reducing hydropower reliance. And that is an urgent requirement in the context of climate change. We also recommend that there's a support for comprehensive risk assessments and data sharing for energy investments in order to avoid damaging mega projects like Baines or the proposed fracking, while de-risking private investment in good projects. Another recommendation is that decision makers consider raising the limit of the modified single buyer model, which could in effect boost investor confidence and create a further enabling environment for new solar and wind and storage capacity. And finally, to identify partnerships of developers and energy consumers to help invest in much needed energy storage capacity, which can make future investments far more attractive. So on that note, we end our panel session. If there are any questions from anybody, please feel free to ask. If you're online, please send a chat. Otherwise, we will do a very quick wrap up, and each speaker can have a couple of minutes to say something, and then we'll close the meeting. So I will open up for any questions, but otherwise the report is available physically as the policy brief is available, and online we're going to share the links shortly hereafter with all those who have participated in the meeting and those who have registered online as well. So the floor is open. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, camera, no, don't need camera, thank you. Ruth Maltze from the Namibia Scientific Society. One question, my knowledge on the Baines project is very limited, but how far has a guarantee been given from Angola's side, seeing that the catchment area is to 90% in Angola's side, that catchment area is not going to be affected by locals, as has been seen in the Okavango Delta area or the Okavango catchment area, where we see the effects in the Delta area of local communities using the natural resources that they have to their availability, and the effects only being seen in the Delta and greatly being seen in the Delta. So what kind of promises, what kind of anything from Angola has come to ensure that the catchment area is not abused and the water that's little already becomes even less? Yeah, that's from my side.
Okay, and maybe we take that one while the online person is trying to ask a question. Who would like to handle that? Conrad or Gretchen?
To my knowledge, no guarantees are given. And with the recommendations we heard from TMP, where activities should take place, what we see in the country is definitely the opposite. You saw the map with all our sanctuaries being free of any development in terms of power generation. But in practice, we have the uranium mines here. A hyphen is opened up. Governments, including the Angolan one, will never give guarantees that their people would be restricted in activities that also could abuse the water resource. And what is deep at my heart is the uranium leaching, which is also badly affecting an aquifer in the southeast of Namibia. Our government let this go ahead to an extent that is probably not easy to stop anymore. So theory and practice differs quite a lot. But I think your question is also good in terms, again, of what is debated between Angola and Namibia. And I think your lead times for a hydro project are extremely short, which you were given 2.5 years and 5 to 7 years or something like this. So the good thing is I think we will never have a kick-off point for the project. If we have one, we are still far from it. And the development of other renewables will go in favor. But I think we should use your question to sensitize Namibia in terms that what is if the Kunene is even drier? At Ruacana, there is a water abstraction for the whole area which holds the biggest part of our population in Namibia, which is the center between Ondangwa, Ongwediva, and Oshakati. What is if this area falls dry in terms of water, not in terms of electricity? And this is a real danger Namibia is facing. So the debate with Angola in terms of your question will heat up because it will be a question pretty soon about life and death in the northern areas around Oshakati.
Referring to your question, we actually had a press release, I think a year ago, and saying we had very good information, saying that the contract was signed between Namibia and Angola. And immediately after that, there was a response from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, actually from the Minister Tom Alvendo, saying that was not true what we published there, and he was not very happy. So he said this contract was never signed. Maybe that shows you the uncertainty between what we know. This is another issue. We are very unhappy about the knowledge we have, or we don't have. We don't get informed about although the ministries know, especially Mines and Energy, that International Rivers and EarthLife Namibia are very, very interested in this topic and very active in this topic. And there is a agreement between ministry and us to get information, or actually more the PJTCT, that's the Permanent Joint Technical Commission on Mines. Yeah, in the beginning we got the idea to have a good relationship and be informed on a regular basis, but it unfortunately never happened. I'm sorry to say this, but it is like that.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. The question is, under the least cost model, what is the potential for gas-fired power from offshore resources such as Kudu?
Well, when we put the model together, I think it's important to emphasize that we modeled different technologies on a kind of dollar per kilowatt basis. So in the case of, say, for example, a Kudu project, we didn't model that as a single unit. It was more about understanding whether the model would select gas-fired power as an option at whatever kind of capacity and whatever size. And as you would have seen from the results, it did not select gas-fired power as an option. There was some assumptions around the Annexus 2 project. We kind of assumed that would come online. You could debate that assumption at this stage because I'm not entirely sure where that stands at the moment. But we assume that would come online, and that would obviously provide some backup power, and that may explain why it didn't select further gas-fired power or further kind of fossil fuel-based power in the model. But just to give you a better sense of how that modeling process worked.
Yeah, I can add to this. Bringing Kudu gas to shore is an extremely problematic and cost-intensive undertaking, because it would require a pipeline on the ground of the Atlantic Ocean in an area which is seismic active, and bringing gas through a pipeline like this also needs a lot of precaution, because basically what is in the pipeline can freeze and get stuck and all these things. And money and the reality speaks. Kudu was probably in the recent years closer to becoming a project compared to Baines, but it didn't succeed. It didn't succeed because Namibia couldn't secure takeoff agreements for the power with our neighbors and other things. So if 10 years ago, where fossil fuels still had a better position against renewables, it didn't go through. It doesn't have any chance these days because the renewables got down so much more in price. So that is, I think Namibia has to wake up and look at the new reality. And the new reality is a distributed power system, like, those people of IBM in the 70s, sort of huge centralized computers. And now the world is living on this distributed computing. And so we also should have an internet of power, maybe still managed by NamPower as a smart grid operator, but not, we have to abandon the idea that power must come from centralized big installations, which also in an African context often creates a problem. Large, centralized, expensive projects cause large corruption, while small distributed projects are more easier overseen in terms of small is beautiful. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly add as well that similarly, the latest IRP results also did not include gas. I think they did run some scenarios, including the Kudu project, but similarly, their kind of unconstrained scenarios and their base case scenarios were predominantly solar, wind, and battery. So just to emphasize the similarity in results there.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we can each just maybe round up if you have anything, I mean, not forced to, but if you have anything just to conclude, and we'll close our meeting.
Thank you, Siva. Well, my heart goes out to the social part, mainly, of course, environment as well. For instance, solar power, and Konrad mentioned it, it's ideal for decentralizing. So we have many areas in Namibia, they are not connected to the grid and will partly never be connected, I believe, because of this far away from our grid. So decentralized power, if these people have access to decentralized power, it makes their life easier. It's good for the environment because they don't need to cut wood anymore. It's always mentioned that children going to school, they don't have electricity, they can't study, etc. There are so many positive impacts if with decentralizing power. And then one issue Karipitua mentioned what would be needed to make the life better of the Himba in that area. This is very logical what he says, but there is, and things were promised to the Himba in case bains will be built. And this is an issue I fail to understand. Why do we need bains to equip that area with solar and wind energy and other renewable or sustainable energy? Thank you.
I think that my kind of key point is that we as TMP, as an organization, and I'm sure a lot of people on the panel will share this sentiment, believe or are absolutely convinced that climate change is already happening. And I think the next 10 years are we're going to see the effects of climate change on all sectors of society. We're going to feel that really intensely. And I believe that we should be thinking in our planning, these kinds of considerations need to be absolutely front and center to that. And Namibia are already exposed to that. So that's, we kind of need to start diversifying the grid to become more climate resilient. And with all of that, I think it's just to really emphasize that point that this is just not the time to be putting all your eggs in one basket and pursuing large hydropower in this this kind of critical point in Namibia's energy transition just does not seem to make sense. And solar, wind, batteries seems like an absolute no-brainer.
Yes, I also want to quickly point out the social effect in terms of the job problem we have in Namibia, or the lack of jobs and the joblessness. And as with food production, I think we should go away from the big commercialized supplier system where we buy everything with money which we have somehow earned in a city type job to deal with our own basics of life, and that is food and that is energy. And I want to mention the opportunities in these two areas, food and energy, in doing your own thing. And the decentralized, small-scale, distributed way of living and of dealing with your own needs is now better possible than ever. And I would hope that as many Namibians as possible grab this opportunity.
My two cents of input. I mean, I'm really calling on civil society to really engage in Namibia on energy issues and just be part of the decision making and support vulnerable communities such as the Himba. And although the Himba would be sort of directly impacted by a dam like Baines, I think there's a rippling effect on the whole country. And based on what Justin and everybody has been saying, I feel like civil society needs to really insist on high environmental standards or high social standards for energy projects, and ensure, consideration for free, prior, informed consent principles in how they engage with government, and just be involved as a civil society in Namibia. And I would have really liked to see a great turnout of civil society, NGOs, I think it's maybe an indication of maybe the lack of interest or lack of awareness around what the impacts of some decisions might be relating to, energy decisions that government might pursue. So on that note, want to say thank you to the panel. Thank you, Karipecha. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Justin, Karipecha. Berchan. Thank you all for participating, and thank you, Akila Hassan, who's doing all our social media and our press. I think after this, we will upload the study as I indicated and the policy brief, and it will be accessible. And any questions, please direct them. The press release is also going up. Please direct any questions to Akila Hassan. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon. Bye.